He stood in the corner of the stage, small beneath the glow of 1,000 lights, a young Filipino boy whose trembling hands spoke louder than words ever could. The air inside the theater was thick with anticipation, a sea of faces waiting to witness another performance. But for him, this wasn't just a performance. It was a dream that had crossed oceans, a prayer whispered through years of struggle, a single chance to turn pain into something beautiful. There had been no easy days where he came from. Back home, the sound of rain leaking through their tin roof was the lullaby that sang him to sleep. His mother worked endlessly, hands rough from washing clothes for neighbors, her eyes always tired but her smile always warm. His father's shoes had long been too worn to keep, the soles torn apart by years of walking from one temporary job to another. There were nights when dinner was nothing but rice and salt, but even then, there was music. He would hum softly in the dark, letting melody fill the spaces where hunger used to hurt. Music was never taught to him. It was something that lived inside him, like a heartbeat that refused to quiet down. When he sang to himself while sweeping the dusty floor or fetching water, people would stop and listen. Some smiled, some wept. They said his voice carried truth, the kind that couldn't be faked. He didn't understand what that meant then. He just knew that when he sang, the world felt lighter, as if all the pain in his family's life could be lifted for a moment and turned into hope. He sang for anyone who would listen. Neighbors, vendors, tricycle drivers resting under the shade, old women selling vegetables at the corner. They gave him coins, sometimes a smile, sometimes food, but more than that, they gave him belief. Each person who paused to listen was like another piece of light he collected. Along the way, his mother used to tell him that every kind soul he met was a note in the song he was meant to sing someday. As years went by, his voice grew stronger, deeper, but still carried that raw, aching honesty. There were times when he wanted to give up, when classmates laughed at his worn-out clothes, when he felt invisible among those who had more, when the weight of poverty seemed too heavy for his young shoulders. But every time despair crept in, he would remember his mother humming softly while hanging wet clothes under the gray sky, whispering, "Keep singing, my boy. Someday someone will hear you." And someone did one afternoon. He was singing in a small plaza during a local event. The microphone crackled. The sound system barely worked, but his voice rose above the noise. In that crowd stood a volunteer from a talent organization, visiting from the city. They noticed something in his tone, a kind of emotion that didn't come from training, but from life itself. Days later, a call came to his small home. It was the first time anyone had ever offered him a ticket out, a chance to audition for America's Got Talent. The journey to that moment wasn't easy. His family sold what little they could. His neighbors collected small donations. Even the tricycle driver down the street contributed a few coins. Everyone wanted him to go. Everyone believed he carried not just his own dream, but theirs too. When he boarded the plane, his hands shook not from fear, but from disbelief. He had never been that far from home before. When he arrived in that massive theater, he felt smaller than ever. The lights, the cameras, the crowd, they were all too big, too bright, too much. The cold air made his fingers numb. Backstage, he could hear laughter cheers, the echo of other performers finishing their acts. He felt his heartbeat in his throat. But he closed his eyes and thought of home, the smell of rice cooking, the sound of rain, his mother's voice telling him to be brave. When his name was called, he stepped forward into the blinding light. The stage stretched endlessly before him, and for a second time stood still. The judges looked at him. The crowd murmured softly, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then he took one deep breath and sang. The first note was delicate trembling. It floated across the silence, like the beginning of a story everyone already wanted to hear. Then his voice grew layer by layer, like waves gathering strength before they touched the shore. There was pain in his tone, but also warmth, like sunlight breaking through clouds. People began to lean forward. It wasn't just his pitch or control. It was the emotion. He sang like someone who had lived 100 lives, like every note was carved from experience. Each word painted an image of struggle, of love, of home. By the time he reached the chorus, tears were already falling in the audience. His voice soared higher, trembling with truth. The crowd could feel the weight behind it, the hunger, the hope. The prayers whispered into the night. For a moment, it didn't matter that he was just a boy. From a small town on that stage. He was every dreamer who had ever dared to believe. And then came the final note. Long pure. Endless, it hung in the air, unbroken, sacred. When it ended, there was a silence so profound that even the cameras seemed afraid to move, and then the world erupted. The applause came like thunder. People stood clapping, cheering, crying. The judges rose from their seats, tears glistening in their eyes. In the middle of it all, the boy stood frozen. Unsure if it was real, his chest heaved. His hands trembled. His lips parted in disbelief. The entire theater had turned into a storm of emotion. Then one of the judges reached forward and pressed the golden buzzer. The world slowed, a golden light burst above him, and confetti poured down from the ceiling, swirling like sunlight in motion. The sound of that buzzer, that single life-changing sound, echoed through his body. His knees weakened. His heart overflowed. He covered his face as tears spilled freely down his cheeks. He looked up, eyes filled with golden tears. The audience was roaring his name, clapping, chanting, crying. He could see the judges smiling through their tears. The golden confetti stuck to his hair, his hands, his clothes. Tiny fragments of a dream finally coming true. For a boy who once sang under the rain, just to keep hope alive, this was heaven. Every image from his past rushed through his mind. His mother's tired hands, the leaky roof, the empty plates, the endless days of singing to no one but himself. Now every sacrifice had a purpose. Every struggle had a voice. When the music faded and he finally stepped off stage, he was met with warm embraces from strangers, staff, even other contestants. They told him his voice had touched their hearts. He smiled shyly, still shaking, still trying to understand how something so impossible had just happened. Later that night in his small hotel room, he sat on the bed, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The golden confetti was still tangled in his hair. He picked one piece up and held it close. It shimmered softly under the light, like a promise. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. Not for more fame, but for gratitude. Gratitude for every soul who had helped him reach this far. Back home, news spread faster than the wind. The small village that had once known only quiet evenings was now alive with celebration. People gathered around small televisions, watching his performance again and again. Children sang his song, neighbors cried together. And his mother, she sat in front of the flickering screen, her hands pressed against her lips, unable to speak through the tears. When she finally saw that golden confetti fall on her son, she wept not from sadness, but from joy that only a mother could understand. She looked at the sky, whispered a thank you, and held her heart as if to keep it from bursting. Days later, when he called home, she couldn't find the right words. She just told him, "You did it. You made them see you," and he cried again. Not from disbelief this time, but from love pure, endless love. The world continued to talk about his performance. Millions watched it online, leaving comments filled with emotion. Strangers said his voice gave them strength, reminded them of kindness, made them believe in something good again. In a world that sometimes forgets how to feel, he had reminded everyone what it meant to be human. He returned home months later, and the airport was crowded with people, waiting to see him, children holding handmade signs, elders with tears in their eyes, friends waving small flags. When he stepped out, applause broke out again. He smiled, humble as ever, and looked for one face, his mother's. She stood near the end, simple as always, wearing the same worn slippers. But when their eyes met, everything else disappeared. He ran into her arms, and they held each other tightly. He took out the small, golden confetti he had saved and placed it in her hand. She held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. That night, back in their tiny home, the two sat in silence. The rain began to fall again, tapping gently on the roof. He sang softly, just like he used to. And his mother listened, tears running down her face, smiling through them. The same roof that once leaked with sorrow now echoed with pride. The world outside might have changed, but home stayed the same, warm, humble, and filled with music. Years would pass, and his story would continue to travel. Journalists would write about him, people would still share his performance, calling it one of the most emotional moments in AGT history, but for him. The true reward wasn't fame. It was the chance to show every child who felt invisible that their voice mattered. He began visiting schools, talking to young dreamers. He told them that success wasn't about luck or wealth. It was about believing, about refusing to give up, even when life seemed unfair. You don't need much, he'd say. Just a song in your heart and the courage to sing it. And when he sang again on other stages, people still cried not because of his fame, but because his voice never lost that purity, that truth. He still sang like the boy who used to sing in the rain, honest, fragile, but unbreakable sometimes when he was alone. He would replay that night in his mind. The bright lights, the roar of the crowd, the golden confetti, all of it felt like a dream he had once lived inside. But what he remembered most wasn't the applause. It was the silence just before he sang. That breath between fear and courage, the moment where he chose to believe in himself. Because that's where everything began. Not with fame, not with recognition, but with faith, the quiet, invisible kind that grows in the dark, until one day it finds its light. And somewhere far away, maybe right now, another little boy sits under a leaking roof, humming softly, believing that if he sings loud enough, the world might hear him, maybe he will. Because once a young Filipino boy proved that sometimes, even from the humblest beginnings, a single song can travel across the world, touch millions of hearts, and remind everyone that no dream is ever too small to shine golden.